Hello, everyone. I'm Vicki Healy at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and I welcome you to today's webinar, co-hosted by the Clean Energy Solutions Center and the Global Women's Network for the Clean Energy Transition. Today's webinar will focus on the topic of gender-sensitive energy policies. Before we begin the presentations, I will go over some of the webinar features and provide an overview of the Clean Energy Solutions Center and GWNet. We will then proceed with presentations from our esteemed group of panelists, followed by a question and answer session moderated by Caroline McGregor. Once we end the webinar, a short survey will pop up on your screen, and we thank you in advance for taking the time to answer a few questions about your impressions of this webinar. A few things to know before we begin. For audio, you have two options. You may listen through your computer or over your telephone. If you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers option in the audio box. And if you want to dial in by phone, select the telephone option, and a box on the right side of your screen will display the telephone number and an audio pin. A gentle reminder to our panelists to please mute your audio when you are not presenting. To illustrate the features a bit more clearly, we've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this in the upper right corner of your screen. You can submit text questions to the presenters by typing your questions into the questions panel. You can send your questions at any time. Caroline will collect these and address them during the Q&A session. And when you submit your question, please include the name of the presenter you are addressing your question to. Today's event is being recorded. If you would like to review the webinar or share this information with others, an audio recording will soon be posted to the Solutions Center YouTube channel. Also, you should receive an email within the next day with a link to access the webinar recording. Now, a little about GWNet. GWNet aims to advance the global energy transition by connecting and empowering women working in sustainable energy in both developed and emerging developing countries. They do this by connecting women through networking, through their advocacy by generating and sharing information, and providing mentoring, coaching, and consulting services. The Clean Energy Solutions Center is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial. The Solutions Center is structured to help governments design and adopt policies and programs that support the development of clean energy technologies. This help is provided through an Ask an Expert technical assistance service, which is offered to governments free of charge and is designed to allow experts to respond quickly to questions. The Solutions Center also engages in capacity building activities, such as the webinar you are attending right now. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. First up is Ana Rojas. Ana is a sustainable development specialist with over 20 years of experience. She is a senior gender and energy consultant with Network Foundation, where she has guided the provision of technical support on gender mainstreaming and policies and projects to different international organizations. Following Ana, we will hear from Monica Madwakwe. Monica is a sustainable energy specialist and works at the ECOWAS Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, where she serves as the focal point and coordinator for the ECOWAS program on gender mainstreaming and energy access. Monica has led the charge in developing the ECOWAS policy for gender mainstreaming and energy access, the regional directive on gender assessments in energy projects, and subsequent national action plans. After Monica, Sam Saunders, an associate at Sullivan & Cromwell, a leading international law firm, will tell us about his work on the ECOWAS Directive and the national policy action plans. Sam and his team provided legal aid throughout the process, and he will speak to us about his team's experiences and the procedures in developing legal frameworks that enable policies to be applied and implemented successfully. Following Sam, Jenny Green, Managing Partner at Sustainable Energy Solutions, will speak to us about a project underway in Nigeria where the Clean Energy Solutions Center is providing support to the Rural Electrification Agency on facilitating gender mainstreaming in their Minigrid program. And last but certainly not least, we will hear from Joy Clancy, a professor of energy and gender and a member of the Department of Governance and Technology for Sustainability at the University of Twente. Professor Clancy will talk to us about gender audits, focusing on Energia's experiences with gender audits in the energy sectors of Kenya, Senegal, and Nepal, with supporting evidence from 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Upon conclusion of the presentations, we will launch into a question and answer session where our panelists will respond to questions you have submitted. The Q&A will be moderated by Caroline McGregor, a consultant who has spent her career working at the intersection of climate change, clean energy, and international development. You likely know Caroline from her leadership and work at Sustainable Energy for All, where she was lead specialist in energy access and gender and spearheaded a range of initiatives, including a multi-stakeholder coalition for gender equality, social inclusion, and women's empowerment in the energy access arena. And now, with the introductions complete, we will begin our presentations. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Vicky. First, let me thank you, the Clean Energy Solutions Center and GW Unit for this opportunity. It's amazing to be here with this panel of great professionals and some very, very dear friends. Thank you for the opportunity. Today, I want to talk to you about Energizing Equality, which is a report that was launched in late 2017. Energizing Equality is a collaboration, or was born as a collaboration between IUCN and Energia. And the reason why we went into this report was because both organizations were wondering, do we still, or can we still say that there are close to no energy policies, strategies, or plans who are addressing gender one way or the other in their text? So what we did is that we went on the net and we identified 192 energy frameworks, which were either in English, French, or Spanish, and we run them through what we call what is called the EGI methodology, the Environment and Gender Information Platform, so that information on whether terms like women, gender were coming into the text, so we can go later on into the context and understand to what degree this mentions were coming into. And to our surprise, we realized that 61 frameworks of the 192 that we were able to look into actually addressed women or gender in their text. So this is definitely something that went beyond what we were expecting from just knowing there was a handful of frameworks to knowing that at least 61 of those that we found addressed gender. And when we went looking into more on the text and where actually these frameworks were coming from, it was very interesting to see that sub-Saharan Africa was producing, not only in terms of numbers, but also percentages, the biggest number in terms of examples. And this was also interesting because as IUCN, they had done also research on gender in mitigations, particularly NDCs, and again, sub-Saharan Africa came up as the front runner in terms of the mentions. And the same happened when the similar assessment was conducted on the C4All country action document. So this region is particularly productive in terms of the text, but I'm very happy to know that Monica and Sam are here to also help us understand how that goes further into also implementation. Another interesting thing that came up is that from the OECD countries, only 4 of the frameworks that we were able to find address gender, but most of those mentions were related to women's participation in the energy workforce, which again is interesting because in most other countries, one way or the other, reference also have to do with energy poverty. But in OECD countries, that link towards energy poverty having a gender face was not made. And I know Joy has several comments on that, if she could. And then for the Latin American region, we also found out that there were only 3 policy frameworks that were addressing gender, but we knew from working in the region that there were other policies that were not coming up in our research. So what we did is that we went up and extended some of the keywords that we used and found out that from the 192 frameworks that we had, 6 actually addressed human rights within their text, 5 of which were actually in Latin America. So even though you do not see them in this graph, it's interesting to see that this region had almost all references to human rights in the energy sector. And the other thing that may be interesting for you to know, if you've not dived into the report, is that we went into trying to understand how women were portrayed in this text. And to the left of the screen, you will see women being visualized as vulnerable or beneficiaries, which is a very passive position. But interestingly enough, the most mentions are actually of women as stakeholders, as important members that have to be included into the discussions and decision-making processes in the energy sector. This is again something that we were very interested to find out. And when we did more dive into the text, we also realized that the mentions to gender were coming into several topics, whether it was time poverty, rural areas, or well-being, which had quite a lot to do with reliance on biomass and energy poverty, which were very, very dominant, but not exclusive. So for example, in rural areas, we were able to find at least 3 policies that were addressing electricity, rural electrification, one of them having a gender angle. Gender seems not to be seen as an urban issue when it comes to energy. Only 2 of the frameworks that we saw actually had particular mentions to women working in, living in urban areas. And perhaps the positive and interesting insight that we've had is with the reference to women being relevant to technology and innovation and their inclusion in the energy sector, whether these policies were acknowledging the fact that there was a gap in participation, or that that women, or that they were actually putting forward information for reducing these gaps. And as I know time is of the essence, I just want to leave you with the conclusions from our side, in terms of first calling for renewable energy policies in particular to address gender in their texts. When we looked into the sample, which was only renewables, we saw that only 18% of them addressed gender. The research also allowed us to see that there is a need to see that there is action taking place, and we map that so that there is no evaporation of the text, and that we need to understand also what are the enabling conditions and the motivations for mainstreaming gender and the policy framework. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And also, I would like to pass the torch to Monica, who I know can speak for hours about how you can motivate and enable conditions to have gender mainstreaming into energy policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Okay, so I'll do my best not to speak for hours. Hello, everyone. My presentation is on the program EcoGen, which produced the regional policy for gender mainstreaming in energy access, as well as the directive on gender assessments in energy projects. After my presentation, I would like you to leave with 2 key points. 1, that regional harmonization works. As an African proverb says, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. Now, the second point is that the regional level is just one step. The closer the policy is to the people, the more effective. And it's for this reason that at ECRI, we promote a 2-pronged approach. One is a top-down approach, where countries say, this is what we want to do. And the second is the bottom-up approach, where we have a wider group of national stakeholders coming together to say, this is how we are going to do it. Now, to my second slide. The purpose of this slide actually is to introduce those who are not yet familiar with ECOWAS to the countries that we cover. It also helps for us to understand how deep an impact a well-designed development intervention could have on the West African population. Now, ECRI, for those who don't know about us, ECRI is a specialized agency for renewable energy, and our mandate is to help address the sustainable energy issues in West Africa. EcoGen is one of the programs through which ECRI achieves its mandate. And EcoGen came about from having gender as a component in one of the projects implemented by ECRI to it becoming a flagship program. The reason for this was because we saw that it was important for us to give gender more visibility in order for us to achieve a stronger result. Now, there are three levels where we see an inequality issue as far as gender is concerned in the energy sector. The first is at the political level, and this concerns whose arguments or experiences are framing energy policies. The second has to do with at the supplier level. The question we ask is, what is the workforce composition? Who is getting paid by the energy sector? And at the third level, which is energy suppliers level, the issue has to do with how is energy access affecting households and businesses across gender lines. Now, based on these gaps, we came up with 4 key objectives which the program aims to address, with the first one being enabling policy environments that are gender responsive. Now, the program itself has 5 high-impact initiatives. 3 of them are women-specific, and the other 2 concern the needs of men and women of all age groups. Now, going to the policy itself. So what we're able to do was to bring together the experiences from the region as it concerns these 3 persistent gaps I mentioned, which is at the policy level, the energy supplier level, and the energy consumer level. Bringing this together, we drew up a set of actions that we felt would address these regional issues. Then we got the authorities, that's the heads of states of the ECOWAS countries, to commit to these actions by them adopting this policy. Now, having obtained their commitment, we went further to develop this directive, the ECOWAS Directive on Gender Assessments in Energy Projects. The directive is simply the legal framework for the policy's implementation. Now, I won't go into the directive because you'll be hearing about it from Samuel, the next speaker. On to my last slide, which is on the national action plans that we're currently finalizing. Now, this is the second part of the 2-pronged approach I had mentioned earlier, where we are now talking to a wider group of stakeholders and asking them, how do you want us to achieve these regional objectives? Now, the process is still ongoing, but we have some countries that have finished their national action plans, and they've also validated them. And I think it's very interesting to see how the different countries are coming up with their own strategy on how they want to tackle the regional problem. Take Togo, for example. Having validated their own action plans, the Cabinet of Ministers came up with an order, a directive, saying that they are going to have a gender focal point at the Ministry of Energy level, but that focal point, that focal institution, will be attached and reporting to the Cabinet of Ministers. So now we are seeing that gender and energy is moving from the ministries of energy into the Cabinet of Ministers forum, whereby it will be discussed across different sectors of the economy. That is all I have to speak about. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everybody. This is Sam Saunders from Sullivan and Cromwell. It's great to speak to you all about a little bit more of the one part of what Monica has led, which is the ECOWAS Directive on gender assessments and energy projects. We are involved because Monica was looking for legal support, and we were happy to support a CRE and coming up with this novel legal instrument on gender assessments. It requires ECOWAS member states to adopt into their own domestic law appropriate legislation or regulations to ensure that gender assessments and gender management plans are prepared before energy projects are approved. And there's flexibility by the different member states on what projects it would apply to and what levels of approvals and management plans are required, but it applies to all the member states, and once it's effective, they will have 2 years to implement it, and it's part of the national action plans that Monica just discussed. I won't read all the slides. I have a lot of slides which you can look at later that go into more detail about what's actually in the directive. I'll just touch on a few things, but kind of the first starting point is, what's the legal basis for this? And actually, if you look around at the international treaties that are applicable to any project, but including West African countries, there's actually quite a lot, and there is a strong legal basis. There's a strong legal basis in the ECOWAS Treaty and other treaties that affirm that the member states need to be considering gender in energy. But despite that, we couldn't find really a precedent directly on point for this type of legal instrument. So what we did was and that just testifies to kind of how ECOWAS has been the leader in this front, and we did consult with policies that various development banks and other organizations have around projects, funding of projects, and gender. And we also use what are analogous instruments under the European Union on environmental impact assessment, which don't cover gender, but do have a framework for when assessments are needed for development projects. I won't go into detail about there was a lot of discussion about kind of what form of legal instrument it should take under ECOWAS law. We ultimately decided on a directive, which gives the member states flexibility, as I said, to enact their own policies and procedures while still being aligned on the overall objectives and the overall requirements. So just a little bit more detail on what the directive has. It applies only to energy projects, but the member states aren't precluded from applying it to other types of development investment projects. And it requires gender assessments and mitigation of gendered impacts and reporting requirements. It's also possible for member states to apply it to other groups besides or other vulnerable groups. It's also possible that they could include measures around that would also promote gender equality, not only assessments but other measures like training, education, etc. So as I said, I have several slides here about what specifically it requires, which I won't go through. I mentioned gender assessment reports, gender management plans, gender performance monitoring reports. There is a concept of a competent authority those of you that may be familiar with environmental social impact assessments and approvals, again, this is analogous to that, and we gave the member states flexibility to incorporate the gender assessment process within their environmental and social impact assessment processes and use the same government agencies to oversee that. There's public consultation requirements. There are duties on project developers to comply with the directive and conduct assessments in accordance with the directive. There's a provision on cross-border cooperation, because as you can imagine, there are often projects that cross borders. There's a requirement that there be penalties in place if developers or other sponsors of projects are not complying. Disputes can be settled with the ECOWAS court. And so it's quite a comprehensive directive, and as I said, very unique, and it was very exciting to work on it. And the text of it is available, and be happy to discuss further on it. What we were very aware of, and Monica and her team very aware of, was how do we actually implement it? What's the best way to achieve results? And the steps for actually implementing it are the member states need to pass legislation or regulations into their own domestic law, and then there needs to be practical steps taken to ensure that everybody is aware of these requirements, is trained on how you conduct gender assessments, how you review them and ensure compliance. Developers need to start complying with the law. The government agencies need to start administering the law. Investors, lenders to projects would require compliance with the law, and affected citizens and civil society would be aware of it and be able to enforce the provisions of the law. And there's obviously practical considerations about how you could actually do that. There are costs, some of which could be recovered from fees. And so what we've been doing recently, as Monica said, was supporting the National Action Plan development, a component of which is how would you implement the directive. It's been some very interesting discussions, and each member state is taking somewhat different approaches to which agency should be responsible for it and how they will roll it out. So we're continuing to work on that, and it's an ongoing process, and very excited to see how it turns out. I think with that, I'll turn it over to Jenny.
Thanks so much, Sam. Good day, everyone. My name is Jenny Green of Sustainable Energy Solutions, and it's been my pleasure to support Vicki Healy at NREL in this ongoing project looking at gender issues in the context of Nigerian mini-grids. My collaborator, Phil LaRocco, who's an instructor at Columbia University in New York, is also on the webinar today, and I have to give him credit for doing most of the intellectual lifting on this assignment. The climate for this work is the Nigeria Rural Electrification Agency, or REA, and perhaps some of the colleagues there, Victor and Simi, and maybe some others who've offered outstanding support and guidance throughout this project may also be on the webinar today. So these friends at REA are hard at work now, not just trying to close the electricity access gap in Nigeria, but also the urban-rural access gap. Here you can see a snapshot of the electricity access situation with 54% overall access, but that divides into 87% in urban areas versus 23% in rural ones. And to the right, you see a population density map, and just below that, a picture of electricity distribution infrastructure. As part of their efforts, REA is engaged in a major mini-grid development program that's totaling around $150 million. And in the last year, the first group of projects through the door have been commissioned. There's around half a dozen of them. And now REA is poised to drastically scale up its operations in 2020. And getting ready for this scale up, they requested from the Clean Energy Solutions Center to have us take a look at how gender mainstreaming can be incorporated into this scale up. So I want to start off the discussion of NREL's gender mainstreaming support to REA using the analogy of a value chain. So if a value chain is a set of activities carried out by firms that together add value to a product and then deliver that product to customers, then just as there's a physical value chain in the energy sector, there's an equally important chain that needs to be built between policy, legal frameworks, and incentives for the private sector. So Phil LaRocco, who worked the most on this project, he terms this the policy to practice value chain. And I think it's a really fitting term for capturing our approach to assisting REA with gender mainstreaming in its Minigrid portfolio. So you've just heard from Monica and from Sam about some of the history of the West African regional policy and the directive, both concerning gender and energy. So the question is, if the policy exists and the directive exists, why go to all the trouble to do such a niche assignment on gender mainstreaming in one energy subsector in one country of the ECOWAS bloc? And I think the point is, our work with REA is really about extending the policy to practice value chain a bit closer to the ground level. So what we actually ended up doing was performing some of the implementation activities that were suggested under Objective 2 of the ECOWAS policy. And then we customized the guidance offered in the directive, since both of these instruments are high level and very general in tone. So for the policy, and this is a verbatim set of activities taken from the policy itself, we developed a gender assessment checklist for agencies to use. With Minigrids, we included a gender dimension into procurement announcements in terms of references, and we prepared a gender assessment toolkit for implementing partners, again limited to the Minigrid portfolio. And importantly, the gender assessment checklist that we developed, they conform to the minimum requirements that have been set forth in Article 5 of the directive. So here you can see our project objectives. We had a couple of different audiences that we wanted to produce tools for. So these included surveyors doing baseline data analysis. We wanted to help REA mainstream gender into its operating documents. We wanted to offer guidance materials to private sector partners, and then also just help strategically REA think more about its work going forward with gender and Minigrids. So in order to do this, we had the opportunity to review documents, and we spoke with 5 private sector developers. And then we tried to translate the core concepts from the policy and the directive into the appropriate formats, harmonizing the message across all platforms, but really customizing the tone and the user experience in each of those. So here's an excerpt from the assessment checklist that we made for surveyors. It's completely coherent with the provisions in the ECOWAS Directive, but it's been adapted for Minigrids, which are at the smaller end of the scale of projects that the directive was designed to cover. This assessment has also been turned into a simplified screening or benchmarking tool that REA can use to identify projects that have a strong gender component, or to propose measures to assist projects that lack a strong gender component at the outset. Based on the research that we've done so far, some preliminary findings have emerged. One finding is that there's very little mention of gender mainstreaming in the national energy policies, laws, and regulations that govern Minigrid development. But 2, a lot of local developers are already pretty advanced in their understanding of gender issues, and they're already trying to be proactive. And then 3, even though developers are trying to be proactive, faced with the situation on the ground, there's a lot of variation between different locales in Nigeria, which is going to impact the extent to which gender equality measures can be pushed, what those measures will look like, and how far they can go. Lastly, we identified the highest impact opportunities for gender in Minigrids as being in employment and in demand stimulation, including productive use support. So we heard from several developers that they appreciate having a diversity of problem-solving styles on their team, and they feel that gender-balanced teams help them connect better with customers. A lot of developers recognized and are working on including women in the equation to increase average revenues per customer, to shift loads, which is obviously important when talking about these solar and hybrid mini grids. And then there's a perception among developers that female businesses represent a good credit risk. So even though developers see the inherent business value in pursuing both of these angles, and some are making significant progress, they are, at the end of the day, mini-grid developers with limited time, with limited gender expertise perhaps, and operating within their business financial constraints. So the potential to form long-term partnerships with other capital and service providers who specialize in things like female education and professional development, enterprise creation and support. This will speed progress on the employment and the demand stimulation fronts, hopefully to everyone's benefit. Well, that does it for me today. Thank you very much. And next we'll hear from Joy Clancy on the topic of gender audits and the degree to which they're effective in integrating gender issues into energy policy. Thanks again.
Hi, thanks, Jenny. Right. I'm going to talk about something from the bottom-up rather approach, which is a particular tool known as the Gender Audit, which was an approach that Energia, the International Network on Gender and Sustainable Energy, developed for engendering energy policy. Just a little bit of background. The presentation I'm giving is based on is a very narrow part of a much fuller report, and it's based on a paper that's available in a journal, which is open access, so you don't have to have a subscription to the journal. And it's so it's a little bit narrower. I'm only going to talk about the gender mainstreaming in energy policy and not in the programs. The problem when you write a paper for a journal is that you end up having to be sometimes a bit pushed around by the journal reviewers, and that's what happened to this paper. And we ended up having to specifically about whether the audits resulted in any mention of, say, gender or women's issues being incorporated into energy policy. But also one of the things that you'll hear about in the findings is related to the building of the capacity of national actors to contribute to the gender mainstreaming in the energy sector. Now, the audits have their origins in another topic that some of you may be familiar with, which is a topic called gender budget, which is a tool to identify and analyse the factors that hinder efforts to mainstream gender in policy. And this concept of a gender budget emerged from the Beijing conference in 1995. And there's a range of activities that are actually not very specific. There are a very large number of them, and I think that's also one of the problems when you talk about gender budgeting. And there's also, there are gender audit budgets, and so the whole, even the naming is a bit confusing. But in general, the gender budgets have set out to both to raise awareness about gender issues in policies, about trying to make governments accountable for their budgeting, and particularly in relation to commitments to the Beijing Platform for Action. And I would say nowadays, of course, one would include the SDGs, which I'll come back to, and also to try to get governments then to commit to these policies. But why then did Energia set about going to do something entirely different? If you've got something that works, why do something different? Well, there's some very good, strong arguments for doing something different. Is that to do a gender budget is very dependent on specialized skills. For example, understanding how to use computable general equilibrium models. I mean, I can just about say that phrase, let alone know how even they would work. So they're highly specialized set of skills. And we were finding that countries in the South had to rely on external experts. And so that's also not very satisfactory. And also it's a very narrow approach. It's not very inclusive approach. And so the majority of citizens don't get an opportunity to influence the way that they think that policy should be formulated. And of course, the data is not available. And you can do an audit, a budget at any government level. So, well, we've been hearing from Monica about what's been going on at the regional level. You can do it national, you can do it at sub-regional level, you can do it for an organization. But certainly, as sure many of you will know, that there is very little gender disaggregated data. Now, then there came and based on this, somebody who you may know, a woman called Caroline Moser, who developed the gender audits as an alternative to gender budgets. And this started basically as an internal evaluation of an organization's gender mainstreaming approaches. And later on, it then became actually having an external evaluation. So you start with your internal, then you get somebody else to look at it for you from outside. There's no standard methodology. Again, the methods are primarily qualitative, and you recognize them, these like checklists, case studies, focus group discussions. So Energia, it's a network and it has a number of members, and this is going back now 10, 15 years. Network members were concerned about the lack of progress with gender mainstreaming in the energy sector. The energy sector has generally been very late to adopt gender mainstreaming. So these audits were seen as a method of raising government awareness about mainstreaming, also providing tools, because often people are aware they need to do something. You know, there comes a mandate from the SDGs, or we saw Sam list a whole range of things, but they don't know how to. So this was to give them a set of tools. And also one of the other important elements of Energia's approach was to provide the group of local gender and energy consultants, so to stop having to rely on external consultants. So then Energia designed its own approach with a training program. Just very quickly, the audit has a facilitator. It then has a team which is made up of a number of different actors. The most important, of course, not surprisingly, is the Ministry of Energy. Then other energy sector organisations like the REA we just heard Jenny talking about, other government departments, the Finance Ministry, the Statistical Office are two very important ones to try to get involved, and academia. And the approach starts with data collection analysis, and basically you are looking to identify factors that are hindering mainstreaming, and also to look at gaps, gender gaps in energy policies. The audit spread out over 6 months because these people are also doing other things, and it completes with a report with recommendations and a gender action plan. Finishes with a validation workshop in which the Energy assumed that the Ministry of Energy takes ownership of the report. And I think that's an important thing, that the assumption that was made. The audits have been done in a number of countries. The three main ones, Kenya, Botswana, Senegal. Then they were the first ones. They defined the methodology was developed. They've been later taken on by other network members, including some of in Monica's region. And each country chose its own focus. And interestingly, India also did a gender budget analysis. Now, did the approach work? Well, it's very, of course, in this sort of thing, it's very difficult to trace causality. You can give some correlation, and have to rely on what people tell you. And I mean, Anna's report actually was really very helpful in this too. It's an important document in this this piece of work. There were certainly direct effects that we could see, that there are signs of either the word gender and women appearing in energy policy. And certainly we saw, as we heard there from Jenny, that you begin to see more gender-aware methods being used, not necessarily in ministries, but certainly in other organisations. More indirect effects, that employment policies are becoming more inclusive. You're seeing more women involved, but also what I've noticed also over time is that men are getting more ready to accept mainstreaming when they focus on gender rather than on women. They then also begin to see that there are benefits. We see more gender desks in ministries of energy, but I have to say that the budgets are not really changing. It's very difficult to find gender budgets. The training program has been was very positively received. We got lots of very positive feedback. We could see this also in work I see getting published, that the number of people who are coming from outside of OECD countries who are publishing reports, papers on gender and energy is certainly increasing, which is good to see. However, there are barriers. There are pragmatic barriers. I think one of the things that, and this was the idea, was to learn lessons from this piece of research. One thing we realised was that Energy didn't have a budget for follow-up activities. So the Gender Action Plan remained a piece of paper. There was no money to do any of the activities mentioned in that. So they just sat on the table. There are lots of conceptual barriers. Gender as a concept is reduced to the gender division of labour. So for people who see empowerment as a much broader concept, then this is just not happening. For changes in women's towards gender equality, and it's still seen in many quarters as a Western imposed concept and therefore resisted. There are political barriers. I think really Energy really didn't understand the political processes, that by targeting civil servants in the ministries of energy rather than political actors, they don't have the power to change. They only have the power to advise. And in some countries, not everywhere, in some countries, the relationship between government and civil society is not always one of trust and cooperation. So it doesn't work everywhere. And I think it's interesting to see what is happening in the ECOWAS region, because this is much more peer-to-peer influencing. And I think it will be interesting to see in a couple of years' time how far that has gone. So in conclusion, does Energy's approach work? Yes, up to a point, but not always as was intended. However, what I see is changing, and I mean, I'm talking about this method was introduced 15 years ago. So of course, the whole context has changed. We now have the SDGs, which give us an enabling environment, that there is a synergy, there is meant to be a link between SDG 5 on gender equality and SDG 7 on energy access. And that also drives the requirement for sex disaggregated data. One thing that I've noticed quite a lot, and it's not just with energy, but a lot of the mainstreaming efforts in the energy sector ignore the Ministry of Women or Gender, whichever, countries vary in this, so they don't get involved. And also UN women in the past were not very interested in the energy sector, and now, again, because the SDGs, they're taking a really very proactive role. I would also say that would be to shift the objectives of a gender audit, make it supportive rather than being seen as criticism. Civil servants don't like being told that they are not, there are huge policy gaps. That doesn't work. I think telling people, here's a tool that can help you meet policy objectives is much more readily accepted. So that finishes my presentation. A number of people to say thank you to Asin, Lydia, and Dira, who helped collect the data and write the reports. all the participants in our data workshops and the key informants we interviewed, also to Energy and the UK's Department for International Development who funded this study, and also to you for listening. So I'm now going to hand you back.
Thank you, Joy. This is Caroline. I'm going to jump right in with questions in the interest of time and say thank you so much to these 5 presenters, 6 if you count Vicki. I've been on many webinars, and quite often people don't stick as well to their time. So well done, you guys. We have probably about 10 minutes for questions. We've had a couple come in. So diving right in, the first one for Sam. I think maybe I'll just read them all out and then pass to you guys to field. I think, Sam, this one's best for you. The question is, when policy laws and regulations are being set, how can we ensure that they address gender? For example, in geothermal projects or hydro projects. Anna, for you, picking up on the human rights framing that worked so well in Latin America, does using that human rights approach make policymakers more open to including gender elements? Interesting question. Those are both from Carla Hernandez. And then Joy, for you, from Christy Jago, she's wondering if you can give examples of, quote, the gender aware methods that you mentioned as direct efforts, just some concrete examples. So maybe we can do it in that order: Sam, Anna, Joy.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, great.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I mean the directive is aimed at a project by project analysis, basically. So it would pick up something like geothermal or solar or fossil fuel project on a project by project basis. But your point and your question is very good as to how do you do it on a maybe sector-wide basis, and that would involve when policies are being set on those technologies or sectors, ensuring that there is an analysis of the gendered impacts of those policies, and that just takes some political economy and efforts by people like ACRI and stakeholders. You could also include in a legal instrument a requirement to factor in gender into policy making. That we didn't take that approach with the directives, but it's certainly something you could do.
Thanks, Sam. Anna, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Caroline. Well, I guess the short answer to the question is not necessarily. We didn't see that the reference to human rights made decision makers more eager to address gender in implementation. When we cross-reference the human rights references to the gender references, from the 6 that we saw that had human rights, only 2 also included gender in their text. And some of the countries that are perhaps doing the most interesting, or one of the countries that's doing the most interesting work in terms of addressing gender in practice, which is Uruguay, you could see that the drive comes from very different directions. So not only from the text on human rights in the energy policy, but also from a very strong structure for on gender in institutional structure and drive. Also, several years back, a very strong commitment from the highest levels at the policy level making, so that this structures were not only based on the Institute of Women's Affairs, but that every ministry, including the one for energy, had gender focal points, strong energy offices. So that this was actually implementable. So the reference is not only, or the click is not only through human rights, but it could be an indication that a country is more eager, but also more convinced and aware that there is social inclusion that needs to happen, and from that angle of social inclusion that they may start developing gender aware or gender responsive strategies.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Joy?
Right, yes, gender aware methods. Well, I would suggest that if you go to the Energia website, there are a number of training manuals which give examples of gender aware methodologies. And similarly, the World Bank's AFREA program also has some. So that's, but I will suggest that, that's rather sounds like I'm not going to try and answer the question. But one example is to start with an organizational assessment. So for an implementing organization or a policy organization is to look at its own way of doing things. What's its gender employment policies? What are its promotion policies? So from its employment, and once you start to do that, it becomes the whole gender aspect starts to become more visible. What's our way of working? If we're doing field work, do we send only men, or do we send women as well? And also, you have to remember: do the women feel comfortable going, to more remote areas? It depends where you are, which country you are from. And also, if you are from the policy side, do we have a reasonable male-female balance in any policy frameworks we're developing? Is there an equality of opportunities to influence? So that's a very quick example of the ways of doing things. But as I say, if you go to the Energia website or to the World Bank's AFREA, there you'll find lots of examples in the training manuals there.
Awesome. Thanks, Joy. I'm going to do another quick round, recognizing that we're just about at the hour, but wanting to get through all the great questions that came in. We have two for Monica. Monica, one question on politics, which is, I think, very astute. How does ECRI and ECOWAS deal with the lack of women in the political space? Because that, of course, creates a barrier to legislation that would be kind of a stronger path forward for this for the gender agenda. Second question is a request for sort of more details on the Women Technology Exchange Program around number of women, number of companies. I think possibly this is something you could answer in the question field if there's like a link to that or something like that, because it looks like we might not get to all the questions. And Joy, question kind of very specifically, how can Energia help us? The questioner's organization, I'm inferring, with gender assessments and training. Maybe you could say a little bit about how Energia gets engaged and kind of works in the field. So Monica first, and then Joy.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Concerning the question on how ECRI or ECOWAS deals with the lack of women in the politics space, I think if you were to look at how ECOWAS itself is trying to make sure that the institution is gender balanced, you see that we are starting by leading from example. So for example, we have a number of commissioners that are females, and we have a very strong advocacy approach to bringing awareness to our heads of states and other leaders of the countries in ECOWAS on the importance of promoting gender balance. So for example, the Vice President of the ECOWAS Commission is a female, and there are different advocacy on ground initiatives that are going to heads of states to talk about the issues of women in power, things of that nature. So I think, to just cap that up, to summarize that, we are leading by example by putting our house in order and going, to the authorities to discuss the issues. I would say that most times when we do have maybe energy ministers meeting or any meetings bringing together key people in government, you see that there's that gender awareness there. people understand that there's a gap and that we need to solve that gap. So I would say that we are getting there. Concerning the Women's Technical Exchange Program, basically what we are doing right now is providing scholarship and opportunities for women in energy to participate in trainings and other capacity building activities being implemented by ECRI. Definitely the idea of the exchange program is to have women working together, spending some time in different institutions and learning from that. So I would say that that is where we are moving to right now. But you can learn more about the exchange program on our website, and also you can always write to me to know where we are. But yeah, we've done a lot of scholarship programs for women to gain the skills to install and receive certification on solar technicians training and all that.
Yeah. It's Joy. Can I just add something to what Monica's been saying? First of all, I don't think it matters in one sense. I mean, in an equality sense, yes, that it's not 50% women and 50% men. But I think you mustn't let men off the hook. It's also men's responsibility to ensure that we have gender equality in the energy sector. It's not just women's responsibility. And having said that, I actually think there's some pretty good, I've noticed this has changed over time, some pretty good male ambassadors, particularly in Monica's region, on gender and energy at the ministerial level. So that is changing, fortunately. Now, back to the question that I was asked. Energia and training. First of all, I have to say I don't work for Energia, so I cannot promise that Energia will do anything for you. So you have to really contact Energia directly yourself. However, what I will say is that those resources that I mentioned earlier about the ideas of examples of gender-aware methods, these were written as training manuals. They are written with a participant's manual with lots of resource material, but also with a trainer's manual, that they were written so that people could take them off the shelf and run a training course based on them. And as you can adapt them and put your own material in them. So, but yeah, I think Energia, you have to contact Sheila Operacher directly, and she will tell you what Energia can do for you directly. Sorry, I can't give you a much more positive, direct answer.
That's great, Joy. Thank you. So I have the go-ahead from Vicky to extend this session about another 10 minutes, but just want to acknowledge for all the participants that we're going a little bit past time, so please hang on with us if you can. Understand if you have to jump. We have another great question, and Jenny, I think I'm going to pass this one to you. So it's from someone who works at the World Bank as an energy geographer, which is a very cool job title. But the question is around data, and data that could be included with the big models that they build, like around the global electrification platform, which she notes in her question is like open source and available online. I'll just read it out at electrifynow.energydata.info. She says, we're looking to include gender on the platform. And so the question is, what data could be used, either included as a layer or georeference data in the algorithm? That's a pretty big data heavy question, but Jenny, maybe you can take a stab at fielding, and then of course, welcome from anyone else on the panel as well.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks for the question. I'm not a data expert, and I can only venture the most cursory of guesses, but you know, I think to get a fine look at who is where and exploiting which energy systems would be helpful. Like, I often struggle looking at countries, you know, trying to parse their census data and see if there's been male-female discrepancies in outmigration from certain regions. So you might see a region is particularly underserved with regards to energy access. It might also be gender skewed. And it's hard. That I think would be a really useful layer to have on some data sets. I also know as mobile phones become more prevalent and people are tracking us everywhere, I would imagine that it could be useful to know such things as like who is physically, where, like who is in the home, who is on which agricultural plot, like what time of day, and think about different, maybe more large scale approaches to getting people the energy systems they need. But I'm happy to spend another half an hour this afternoon thinking more deeply about that, and maybe being in touch by email. But that's a really great question, and I think there's so much more that we can do now with data that we're not doing yet in terms of gender.
Yeah, Jenny, I think that's totally right. So we can be excited about kind of what's on the horizon. Hopefully in the next 10 years, we'll have a whole different range of tools available to us. I have a couple of my own questions that I'm going to go ahead and pose. You guys, they're kind of broad. They're kind of stepping back and looking broadly at the space. We've talked a lot about kind of building policies, kind of following through on this great ECOWAS directive. But I think if you look globally, there are a lot of policies that get written and kind of put on the books, but then don't necessarily get enforced. It's kind of like a nice thing to say, the checkbox exercise has been kind of completed, and then there's some missing pieces that prevent the policy from being as powerful as the writers intended it to be. And I just wonder if we could hear from anyone who's inspired to chime in, but maybe Joy, Monica, Jenny, anyone, like what makes the difference, in countries where you have seen that follow through, what was present? Joy, you mentioned kind of gender focal points in cabinet. You also mentioned budgets and how they're sometimes lacking. Like what's the key to seeing this be realized? So maybe I'll open it up in that respect. Joy, maybe if you're willing to take the first stab, and then anybody else, please jump in.
Yes, yeah. I mean that's a good question. What brings the change? Certainly, well, the first step is creating the awareness. That's, in one sense, that's rather obvious. But what the energy work shows is that if you don't have any sort of budget, then nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to change. And part of the getting the budget is creating an awareness and a political voice at the level of the citizen. And I think one of the things that you're beginning to see this, and people are doing some work on looking at this, is in India. That the governments or political parties have begun to see women as a key stakeholder group within society, and they are then now starting to implement policies that also take into account women's voices. And that includes, and there are people who argue that the LPG program in India is linked to this. So it's getting yourself recognized as a political force in where that you're a constituency, that governments, political parties want you to vote for them at elections, so that they will begin to include your requirements into their policy frameworks. That's what I would say. That's one of the places that I would suggest. I don't know if anyone else has got anything to add to that.
I think you're right, though, that the political, the impetus, the political capital and leverage does make a difference. We see that in our own countries.
This is Sam.
Yeah, Sam, go ahead, please.
I was just going to add, based on our experience in working on the directive, and it's also about designing the policy in a smart manner. And for example, the directive is aimed at putting an obligation on sponsors of projects to conduct the assessment. And generally, these sponsors will want to do the project and will have some money. There'll be some economic case for it, and they're going to already be paying fees, or hiring consultants to do assessments for environmental and social impact assessments. And so the idea is to integrate it already into that existing process and leverage, the existing procedures and the existing economics and fees to just kind of as seamlessly as possible implement the policy. And then the other aspect of it is that a lot of projects have funding from multilateral banks, international lenders that have policies, certainly that would be requiring the developers to comply with law and also to comply with best practices and in environmental social impact assessment. And so when you need money from those lenders, then you have to comply with the policies and comply with and conduct the gender assessment. So the idea was to think about how we can get the private sector to build some momentum and implement the policy effectively on its own without as much need for political drive from the government.
Great. Did someone else want to come in?
Hi, yes, it was Anna.
Great.
Yeah, but I'm conscious about the time. So just let me say that I wanted to build on some of the things that Joyce said during her presentation, in the sense that a lot of political will, especially at the highest of levels, is necessary. I'm thinking about the case of Nepal, in which the mandate for addressing gender equality and social inclusion comes from the constitutional transformations that happened not that long ago, and how when you have such an anchor at that highest of levels, then there is no other way but for institutions to try and figure out how to bring that into implementation. And that does take time, but is that you need that structure, which is also what Sam was alluding to. You need the higher structure that can give the push, so that when you're doing the work, you're not just putting in peril those persons at the ministry, who Joy was rightly mentioning. I mean, they can just give advice, but you have this larger sense and process in terms of, this is what we need to do, because we do have to show that this national mandate is actually happening.
I think that's great, Anna. Thank you. Vicki, I'm going to pass to you for the wrap up.
Great, thanks, Caroline. And Caroline, thank you so much for your skillful moderation. And I'd, of course, love to thank our panelists for sharing your expertise and knowledge, and absolutely thank our attendees for submitting your great questions. We've all learned a lot from both the panelists and from you through the questions that you've shared. So just real quickly before we go, again, I'd like to extend a very hearty thank you to our attendees. We really appreciate your participation and your time, and we hope that you found today's webinar valuable and you're taking away some very good information that is going to be helpful to you in both your professional and your personal lives. Just a quick reminder that a short survey will pop up on your screen after we end the webinar, and we appreciate you taking a minute or two to answer these survey questions. Your feedback is very important to us. With that, I send you all good wishes, and this concludes our webinar. Thank you for attending.